Hello. Well, we have a time ride tomorrow, and so I thought I'd do one more review video cast real quick. So I am going to just talk about the 3 prompts that you could get for World War I tomorrow, and then we'll call that, or that'll be kind of the end of what we're doing here. So it was the U-boat campaign of 1917. So the U-boat campaign of 1917, which brought the United States into the First World War. To what extent do you agree with this statement? The key part of this statement is the U-boat campaign of 1917. We've already talked about that quite a bit. The U-boat campaign of 1917 was the Pless Castle Conference. And then when you go from the Pless Castle Conference, they announced it in February, and then boats start going down on a much higher level, and U.S. boats are part of that. The city of Memphis and 3 other boats. Just in a couple days in March, the USS Housatonic, the Laconia, where Americans died. And so you just see a great amount of U.S. ships going down, and that eventually leads to the U.S. coming to war in April. Now, the one issue is, why did the U.S. wait as long? But given the amount of ships that were sunk, the U.S. had no choice. Now, the question really, as far as agreeing with this statement, is it was the U-boat campaign of 1917 which brought the United States into the First World War. But that is a simplistic way of looking at it. It was Link's argument. Link basically said it was this campaign that brought it in. It was the Germans that forced the U.S. to choose this path. It was the Germans that forced the U.S. to, by not keeping the Sussex Pledge, and forced the U.S. to war. Now, the counter-argument, and where I think it's really interesting in looking at this, is where Clement comes back and he really looks at the haphazard policy. He feels like the U.S. approach to this was a haphazard policy. But I think what's really interesting is when you take a look at, okay, so why was the Sussex Pledge necessary? Why did the Germans have to keep the Sussex Pledge? And I think you can go all the way back to strict accountability, and that the U.S. was putting a lot more pressure on Germany than they were on the United States. And you can see that, yes, the campaign of 1917 brought the war, but that was only because the U.S. forced Germany into the Sussex Pledge, which they couldn't keep. And so the U.S. basically forced Germany into these positions, which then led to that campaign mattering. The U.S. also took actions that kept the U-boat campaign. They could have taken actions which would have removed U.S. from different ships, would have removed U.S. from the war waters, would have created a much different situation. And they chose not to do that. All right, so let's move on to the next one. Just pointing out the 2 most important parts here. To what extent, and remember, don't say to what extent, but show it exactly in your thesis, and then the U-boat campaign. Why the United States adopt a policy of neutrality? Well, policy of neutrality, which is an interesting term, right? That the United States was officially neutral. They did try to get the application of the Declaration of London accepted, failed to do so. They put a ban in place that let them know that, hey, this is what's happening. They did a series of different actions which did show some neutrality, but when you really examine what happened, given that U.S. banks in 1915 or 1914, before the ban was lifted, the so-called ban, the U.S. was already lending to these other nations. U.S. banks were lending to these other nations. The government began to do that at the same time. The policy of neutrality, though, needs to be answered. Why did the United States adopt a policy of neutrality? I think you can go back and look at their isolationist tradition, the idea that they don't feel like they should be in entanglements with Europe. They wanted to stay out. They felt like it was another European war, which didn't concern them. And this seemed to be the popular sentiment of most people. Wilson won that in 1916. election by keeping us out of the war. So I think one of the other reasons the U.S. adopted a policy is nobody wanted to go to war. It was not a popular war within the United States, and it was not one that people felt like needed to be fought. So Wilson used a lot of ideological language to talk about their entry into the war, but most people felt like the U.S. needed to go into war because they were attacked in the submarines. And so there was a sense that the U.S. was truly neutral, populace-wise, but when you take a look at the actions of the government, I think you can see pretty clearly that there wasn't really a true policy of neutrality. And I think that's where you would challenge this prompt going forward. Evaluate the circumstances that led to the shift in the American position regarding the entrance to World War I. Again, there's assumption to this question that there was a shift. Either way, you still have to answer it, and evaluate is asking you to really weigh the strengths and weaknesses of the circumstances, really weigh what happened in those circumstances, and basically what led them to make that shift. What were the major things? You have to kind of come to a decision there. But you need to evaluate all the circumstances that come around it. Well, I think what you're looking at, what you're looking at with this is that basically the United States did not really have a shift. There was no shift, but you need to basically talk about, there was no shift and it felt like the United States just moved towards war. But I think you could say if there was a policy of neutrality, then there was a shift for the U.S. entering the war. There was a shift in public opinion from no war to war. But did the government shift? And so I think you could break in that and look at that shift from a couple different reasons. I think you could look at it in several different ways. So basically, that's about all I have for you. But I think it's really important when you're examining and getting ready for this time, right, that you go through and really think through these prompts, have thesis statements that you kind of have planned out, and then begin to kind of do some outlines that you'd be able to produce pretty quickly in a pre-write. Because I'm going to expect all of you to do pre-writes tomorrow. I'll kind of give you the time in which I think you should start writing, but I think everybody needs to do a pre-write to make sure that they can focus on asking the key question for this time, right, which is why does this matter? So as you're writing it, really looking at why does this matter? Why does this evidence matter to answering this question? Why does this evidence matter to answering this question? And if you're able to answer that and really come back and say that, then I think you'll find a lot more critical commentary in this essay. And the key then is to make sure that you still cover the same amount of information you covered before. So the key is to balance the need for critical commentary with still coverage of the different content and everything that's important. So good luck, and I will see you tomorrow.